Hello and welcome to my presentation on the sometimes mysterious and often bizarre bacteria Lyme disease. Today we're going to go over a lot of what we learned about it over the last few years. It's sometimes referred to as an autoimmune disorder. So there's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So while the disease itself is still relatively new to the medical community, it is thought to have been bouncing around between ticks and wildlife for over 60,000 years in America. It wasn't until 1976 that it was first described by doctors in Lyme, Connecticut, where it's got its fancy name. By the mid-1980s, there were approximately 1,500 new cases a year affecting the Northeast. So where does this happen? Well, luckily for us down here in South Texas, few if any cases are reported outside the northernmost reaches of the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, it was first described by doctors in the northeastern seaboard in Connecticut, where many cases have been rampant for the past 3 decades. But sometime around the late 90s and early 2000s, it began to spread west throughout the upper Midwest, northern Midwest, and all the way over to northern California and the Pacific Northeast. By 2020, it was called the most common vector-borne disease in the Northern Hemisphere. Well, who's getting infected by this disease? Well, it turns out it's mostly white and Caucasian people in the northern reaches. As I mentioned before, in the mid-80s, there were roughly 1,500 new cases a year, but by 2018, the last year a comprehensive study was conducted, over 23,000 cases were confirmed, with another 10,000 probable. So what is Lyme disease? Well, like I mentioned earlier, it is still relatively new to the medical community, so they're still learning more about it every year. But what we do know about it is that it is a bacterial infection that overwhelmingly comes from the bites of infected ticks. But if caught and properly diagnosed early, it can easily be treated with antibiotics. But if left undiagnosed, it can seriously wreak havoc on a person's autoimmune and nervous system. So how do people get infected with these things? Well, usually it happens while they're outdoors. They could be out camping or fishing or hunting or hiking in the woods. They'll just get bit by what is called a nymph tick, which is these tiny, like 2 millimeter big, little tiny baby ticks that are about the size of a poppy seed. Now they can stick to any part of your body, but they're usually found attached to really difficult to find spots, like right up in your groin or your armpit or all the way up in your scalp. Now, if this tick, and it is infected, goes undetected on your body for 36 to 48 hours, you start to develop a rash. So that rash, which is called an erythema migris, will develop with a dark center and a ring around it. Start to look like a target. Other early symptoms will include things like fever and chills, headache, fatigue, muscle and joint pain, swollen lymph nodes. Now, like I said earlier, if caught early and treated with simple antibiotics like penicillin, it can clear up. But if left untreated and undiagnosed, it can seriously damage the immune and nervous systems. Serious headache starts, the EM rashes break out all over your body, facial palsy where one side of your face will droop, arthritis, heart palpitations, dizziness, inflammation to the brain and spinal cord. One interesting side note here is that many have been misdiagnosed with everything from arthritis to serious mental disorders like schizophrenia. So what's happening inside the body at the cellular level? Well, the bacteria itself look like little strings of spaghetti. They're called microtubes. These microtubes will get into your blood vessels and will form bonds with the blood vessel walls. While one end of the microtube is building a bond with one vessel wall, the other end is swinging like a kid on the monkey bars against the blood flow until it spreads throughout the body, eventually affecting the brain or the heart. So researchers have found that a bacterial protein called BBK32 is what the disease uses to strengthen the bonds and stabilize the bacteria inside the vessel walls. By targeting this protein with drugs, we have been found to prevent spread. Interestingly, though, the pathogen that causes Lyme disease in a totally unique function can exist without iron, which is what all other life on Earth needs to create protein and enzymes. So while the disease is rampant in certain areas and can be easily diagnosed and treated, if untreated and undiagnosed, it can lead to a seriously wrecked existence. This is something that they found out in the early 2000s when it spread over to California and in the West Coast. People were coming in with all of these symptoms that they weren't treating properly, and they would end up with a disease for several years before figuring out what was going on. American writer Steve Kotler opened up about his experience having Lyme disease for several years on the Joe Rogan podcast. According to Kotler, the disease left him all but helpless and in bed for 3 years. To quote, "I was ready to kill myself. I could only function for about an hour each day, and I was only going to be a burden to all of my friends and family." It wasn't until one day when several friends convinced him to get out of bed and go surfing. After the one day of surfing, he felt better for a few days, and then it was down again, so he forced himself to get out and go again. Eventually, he was able to get over the disease and live a normal life, but not before being out of commission for several years. So that's about it. That's about what doctors know about Lyme disease right now. And it's pretty terrifying when you think about it. This little tiny tick can get on you and basically wreak havoc on your entire body. It's pretty bizarre to think about, but that's the power of bacteria. Anyway, I sure enjoyed making the video, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. Have a good night.